On the day my husband died, I kept a secret worth $28 million, and no one at that funeral had any idea. I remember how still the air felt inside the chapel, like even the world outside had paused out of respect, or maybe out of anticipation for something none of them could see coming. The soft hum of the organ lingered in the background, and the scent of lilies sat heavy in my lungs, almost suffocating, as if grief had a fragrance of its own. People kept walking up to me, one by one, offering their condolences, their careful words, their gentle touches on my arm, but I barely heard any of it. I nodded when I was supposed to nod, smiled when it seemed expected, and kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, just like I had practiced during the long, sleepless night before. Daniel stood a few feet away, shaking hands, thanking guests, playing the part of the devoted son so convincingly that anyone watching would have believed it completely. Beside him, Sophia held his arm, her posture perfect, her expression just the right mix of sadness and composure, like she had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. Every now and then, she glanced at me, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to see the calculation behind her eyes. That was when I knew for certain that she thought the game was already over. The minister spoke about my husband's life, about his kindness, his work, his legacy, and I listened carefully, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to remember exactly how they all saw him in this moment. A good man, a generous man, a man who had built everything from nothing, a man who, according to everyone in that room, had left his affairs in order. I almost smiled at that part, because if there was one thing my husband had always been, it was meticulous. He never left anything unfinished, never overlooked a detail, and certainly never trusted blindly when it came to protecting what he had spent a lifetime building. 2 days before he passed, he had looked at me in a way I hadn't seen in years, steady and certain, like he already knew exactly how everything would unfold. He didn't say much, just a quiet reminder that I should trust him, that everything I needed would be taken care of. At the time, I thought he meant emotionally, that he was trying to comfort me, to make the inevitable a little easier to bear. I didn't realize he was talking about something much bigger, something no one else in that room had even considered. When the service ended, people began to gather in small groups, whispering, sharing memories, exchanging the kind of polite conversations that always follow loss. I stayed seated a little longer than I needed to, watching Daniel and Sophia from across the room. I noticed how quickly they moved, how easily they slipped into quiet conversations with the attorney, how Sophia leaned in just slightly when certain topics came up, as if she already knew what was going to be said. That was the moment everything became perfectly clear to me. They believed they were in control. They believed whatever had been left behind was already theirs to manage, to spend, to reshape into their own future. And I let them believe it. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't mention the account, the one that had never been discussed, the one that didn't appear in any of the documents they thought they understood. $28 million, sitting exactly where my husband had placed it, untouched, unseen, and entirely beyond their reach. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my black dress, and made my way toward them with the same calm expression I had worn all morning. Sophia turned first, offering me that carefully crafted smile, the one meant to reassure, to soften, to control the narrative before I could say a word. Daniel followed, his eyes searching mine for something, maybe approval, maybe permission, maybe absolution. I gave him none of those things. Instead, I simply nodded, just enough to keep the peace, just enough to let them think I was exactly what they needed me to be in that moment. Grieving, confused, powerless. What they didn't understand was that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes, silence is where the real power begins. The house felt different the moment I walked back in, not because anything had changed, but because everything suddenly meant something else. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked a little louder than I remembered, each second stretching longer than it should, as if time itself was waiting for me to catch up. I set my purse down on the same narrow table where I had placed it for years, right beside the porcelain bowl Daniel had made in elementary school, the one I had refused to throw away no matter how uneven it looked. For a long moment, I just stood there, taking it all in, the familiar walls, the framed photographs, the quiet that used to feel comforting but now felt like a warning I had ignored for too long. 2 days earlier, My husband had been sitting in his usual chair by the window, the late afternoon light falling across his face in that soft golden way he always liked. He had not looked weak. He had not looked afraid. If anything, he looked resolved. I remember how he folded his hands slowly, how he watched me instead of the television, as if he was measuring his words before deciding which ones I needed to hear. He told me there were things I would learn after he was gone, things that might not make sense right away, but that I had to trust him, no matter how things appeared. At the time, I thought it was just another way of saying goodbye, another attempt to ease my fear of being alone. I did not realize he was preparing me for something much colder than grief. That night, after everyone had left and the sympathy calls had slowed to silence, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never drank. The surface had gone cold long before I noticed, but I kept holding it anyway, as if the habit itself could keep everything steady. Daniel had called earlier, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, telling me he and Sophia would be coming by the next morning to help me organize some paperwork. He said it gently, like he was doing me a favor, like he was stepping into a role he had been waiting for. I could hear Sophia in the background, not speaking, just present, the way she always was when something important was being decided. I agreed without hesitation, keeping my voice calm, giving them exactly what they expected to hear. What they did not know was that I had already started looking. It began with something small, a drawer my husband rarely used, tucked behind a stack of old documents I had seen 100 times before but never questioned. Inside, there was a folder that did not belong with the rest, thinner, newer, placed just slightly out of alignment, as if it had been hidden in plain sight. I remember how steady my hands felt when I opened it, how quiet the room became, as if even the clock had stopped ticking for a moment. The documents inside were not complicated, but they were precise: numbers, account details, instructions written in my husband's careful handwriting, each line confirming what I had not yet allowed myself to believe. It was all there, exactly as he had promised, separate from everything else, untouched by the plans Daniel and Sophia thought they understood. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back where I had found it, not because I wanted to forget, but because I wanted to see what they would do next. The following morning, when Daniel and Sophia arrived, they moved through the house with a confidence that felt almost practiced, opening cabinets, gathering papers, speaking in low, controlled voices as if I were not in the room. Sophia took the lead without asking, directing Daniel towards specific files, mentioning documents she claimed needed to be reviewed immediately, her tone polite but firm in a way that suggested she had already decided everything. Daniel followed her without question, nodding, agreeing, avoiding my eyes whenever I looked his way. I watched them from the kitchen doorway, my hands resting lightly against the counter, my expression unchanged. They believed they were helping me. They believed I needed guidance, protection, structure. What they did not realize was that every move they made, every word they chose, was showing me exactly how far they had already gone without me. And I let them continue, because sometimes the clearest truth is not what people say, but what they assume you will never notice. I began to notice that it was not what they said that unsettled me, but how easily they moved through decisions that no longer seemed to include me. Sophia stood at the dining table, sorting through folders as if she had done it 100 times before, her fingers gliding over documents with quiet certainty, occasionally setting one aside with a small nod to herself. Daniel lingered nearby, holding papers he barely glanced at, waiting for her direction before doing anything, just as he had been doing since the day he married her. It was a subtle shift, one that had happened slowly enough over the years that I had almost convinced myself it was natural, that this was simply how families evolved. But standing there now, watching them in my own home, I could see the pattern clearly, and it no longer felt harmless. Sophia paused when she came across a stack of older financial statements, her eyes scanning quickly before she turned to Daniel and lowered her voice, though not enough to keep me from hearing. She mentioned consolidating accounts, simplifying structures, making things more manageable moving forward. Daniel agreed without hesitation, his tone soft, agreeable, as if he trusted her completely with decisions that had never belonged to her in the first place. I leaned slightly against the doorway, letting my presence remain quiet, observing the rhythm between them, the unspoken understanding that placed her in control and him somewhere just behind her. At one point, Sophia looked up and offered me a gentle smile, the kind meant to reassure, to suggest that everything being done was for my benefit. She spoke carefully, explaining that handling finances after a loss could be overwhelming, that it might be easier if they took care of certain things on my behalf. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and almost convincing, but there was a precision in her words that made it clear she had thought about this long before she stepped into my kitchen that morning. I nodded, just enough to keep the moment comfortable, allowing her to continue without resistance. What they did not realize was that every suggestion she made, every document she prioritized, was revealing something far more valuable than any number on a page. It was revealing intent. Later, as they moved into the study, I followed at a distance, not intruding, simply existing within the same space, listening as they spoke in lower tones. That was when I heard it, a single sentence from Sophia that shifted everything into place. She mentioned a transfer that had already been initiated, something about ensuring assets were positioned correctly before any complications could arise. Daniel asked a brief question, uncertain, but she reassured him quickly, telling him it had all been handled through the appropriate channels, that there was nothing left to worry about. Nothing left to worry about. The words lingered in my mind long after she said them, echoing against the quiet walls of the room. I did not interrupt. I did not ask for clarification. Instead, I stepped back, allowing the conversation to continue without me, because in that moment, I understood something important. They were not just reacting to my husband's passing. They were executing a plan they believed was already in motion, one that assumed I would remain exactly as they saw me, grieving, distracted, unaware. That afternoon, after they left, I returned to the kitchen and stood by the window where my husband used to sit, looking out at the same stretch of yard he had spent years tending with quiet pride. The sunlight fell across the floor in the same soft pattern, unchanged, steady, almost indifferent to everything that had shifted beneath it. I placed my hand against the counter and let the silence settle around me, not heavy this time, but clear, because now, for the first time since the funeral, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was beginning to understand what was about to happen next, and more importantly, what I was going to allow them to believe until it was too late. That evening, I did something I had not done in years. I opened the study door and stepped inside without hesitation, without asking permission, without feeling like I was intruding on a space that had once belonged more to my husband than to me. The room still carried his presence in small, quiet ways, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the wood, the chair slightly angled toward the window, the stack of notebooks, arranged with the same careful precision he had always insisted on. I walked slowly to the desk and rested my fingers on the surface, remembering how many evenings he had spent there, reviewing numbers, making notes, thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. For most of our marriage, I had trusted him completely with these things, never questioning how he structured our finances, never needing to understand the details because I believed in his judgment. Now, standing there alone, I realized that trust had not been blind, it had been earned, and more importantly, it had been intentional. He had never been careless, and that meant whatever he had set in motion before he passed was not accidental, it was deliberate. I opened one of the drawers slowly, not searching in panic, but with purpose, remembering the folder I had found the night before and the way it did not quite belong with the rest. This time, I looked deeper, moving past the obvious documents, the ones Daniel and Sophia had already sorted through, and focusing instead on the details they had overlooked. A small envelope tucked behind a ledger caught my attention, plain, unmarked, easy to miss unless you knew to look for something that did not announce itself. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper and a key, nothing ornate, just a standard safety deposit key with a number etched into the metal. The paper was written in my husband's familiar handwriting, steady, precise, unmistakable. He had listed a bank name, a branch location, and a short instruction that made my breath pause for just a moment. He had written that everything important was secured properly, that no one else had access, and that I should wait before taking any action. Wait until they reveal themselves. I read that line twice, then a third time, letting the meaning settle into something clearer, something sharper than the confusion I had been holding on to since the funeral. He had known, not just about the money, but about them, about the way things had been shifting beneath the surface, about the quiet changes I had noticed but never fully acknowledged. I closed the drawer carefully and stood there in the stillness, holding the key in my hand, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as confirmation. The next morning, when Daniel called again, his tone more direct this time, asking if we could meet with the family attorney to finalize certain arrangements, I agreed without hesitation. Sophia's voice followed shortly after on speaker, suggesting a time, a location, her words framed as helpful, efficient, necessary. I listened without interrupting, offering simple answers, keeping my voice calm, giving them no reason to question anything. When the call ended, I placed the key back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer exactly as I had found it, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Because now, I understood that this was no longer about reacting to what they were doing. It was about allowing them to continue, to move forward with complete confidence, to believe that every step they were taking was bringing them closer to something they already owned. And the more certain they became, the less prepared they would be for the moment everything shifted. I walked back into the hallway and paused beside the grandfather clock, listening to its steady rhythm, each second measured, deliberate, unchanging. For the first time since my husband passed, the silence around me did not feel empty. It felt controlled, like a space I could finally shape instead of endure. Because grief had not taken away my ability to see clearly. It had simply removed the distractions that had kept me from seeing the truth sooner. And now that I could see it, I had no intention of looking away. The next day, I drove to the bank alone, choosing a time when I knew it would be quiet, when no one would be watching closely enough to remember my face or my name. The branch my husband had written down was not one we used regularly, tucked away on a side street about 15 minutes from the house, the kind of place that blended into its surroundings without drawing attention. I parked my car beneath a row of neatly trimmed trees and sat there for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, not out of hesitation, but to steady the rhythm of everything I was about to confirm. When I stepped inside, the air felt cool and neutral, the low murmur of conversations and the soft tapping of keyboards creating a kind of background noise that made everything feel routine, ordinary, almost forgettable. I approached the front desk and spoke calmly, giving my name, explaining that I needed assistance with a safety deposit box. The woman behind the counter smiled politely, asked for identification, and disappeared for a few minutes before returning with a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as the branch manager. His tone shifted slightly when he saw the account details, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. He asked me to follow him, his steps measured, his voice more formal now as he led me down a narrow hallway into a secured room lined with rows of small metal boxes. The sound of the door locking behind us was soft, almost reassuring. He retrieved the box that matched the number on my key and placed it on a small table, then stepped back to give me privacy, as if he understood without needing to be told that whatever was inside was not meant for anyone else. When I inserted the key and turned it, the click felt final, like a line being drawn between what I had suspected and what I was about to know for certain. Inside, there were several neatly organized documents, each one labeled in my husband's careful handwriting, along with a thin envelope that felt heavier than it should have. I opened the documents first, scanning slowly, absorbing the structure, the intent, the precision of everything he had arranged. The account was real, separate from all others, protected by layers I recognized immediately as deliberate barriers, safeguards designed to ensure that no one could access it without my direct involvement. There were instructions for transferring funds, contingencies for legal challenges, and most importantly, a clause that made my breath catch for just a second before I steadied myself again. It stated clearly that any attempt to reassign or claim assets without full disclosure to me would trigger an automatic review, freezing all related accounts until the matter was resolved. I read that line again, this time more slowly, letting the implications settle fully into place. My husband had not just hidden this money. He had built a system around it, one that anticipated exactly the kind of behavior I had begun to witness. When I opened the envelope, I found a letter addressed to me, short, direct, written in the same steady hand I had known for decades. He told me that if I was reading this, it meant things had unfolded the way he feared they might, that I should trust my instincts, and that I should not rush to act. He reminded me that timing mattered, that truth revealed too early could be dismissed, but truth revealed at the right moment could not be ignored. I closed the box carefully, returning everything exactly as I had found it, my movements calm, deliberate, controlled. When I stepped back into the hallway and the manager asked if there was anything else he could assist me with, I simply thanked him and said no. Outside, the sunlight felt brighter than it had that morning, the world continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. As I drove home, I thought about Daniel and Sophia, about the confidence in their voices, the certainty in their actions, and how completely they believed they understood the situation. I realized then that I did not need to confront them, not yet, not when they were still building something on a foundation they assumed was solid. Because now I knew the truth in full, not just pieces, not just suspicions, but the entire structure my husband had left behind. And with that knowledge came something stronger than grief, something quieter, steadier, and far more powerful. It was not anger. It was clarity, and clarity has a way of turning even the smallest moment into something decisive when the time is right. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt quieter than usual, not empty, but watchful, as if it already knew that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I placed my keys on the table and moved through the room slowly, not out of hesitation, but with intention, noticing details I had overlooked for years, the way the light settled across the furniture, the faint marks on the hardwood floor where chairs had been moved too often, the small imperfections that told the truth about how life had really been lived here. For a long time, I had believed that family meant continuity, that no matter how things changed, there was always an underlying loyalty that held everything together. But standing there now, with everything I had learned resting quietly in my mind, I realized that loyalty is not something that exists simply because it should. It exists because people choose it, and sometimes they choose something else entirely. Later that evening, Daniel called again, his tone more direct than before, less careful, as if he had already begun to assume a certain authority over what came next. He mentioned the meeting with the attorney, confirmed the time, and then added that it would be helpful if I brought any remaining documents I had not yet shared. His wording was polite, but there was an expectation beneath it, a quiet pressure that suggested he believed he was stepping into a role that no longer belonged to me. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish, then agreed in the same calm voice I had used all day. Sophia's voice followed briefly in the background, offering a reminder about specific paperwork, her tone efficient, almost managerial, as if this were simply another task to be completed. When the call ended, I remained standing by the window for a while, watching the sky darken slowly as the evening settled in. I thought about the letter in the deposit box, about the way my husband had written that timing mattered, that truth had a weight to it that could only be felt when revealed at the right moment. He had never been a man who acted without purpose, and I understood now that this was no different. He had not only prepared for the possibility of being gone, he had prepared for what might happen afterward, for the choices others might make when they believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. The next morning, I took out a small selection of documents, not everything, only what I knew they expected to see, the kind of papers that would confirm their assumptions without challenging them. I placed them neatly into a folder, aligning the edges carefully, making sure everything appeared exactly as it should. When Daniel and Sophia arrived to pick me up for the meeting, they greeted me with the same practiced warmth, their expressions composed, their movements efficient. Sophia asked if I had everything ready, her eyes scanning the folder in my hands before I even answered. I nodded, offering a small, quiet smile, the kind that suggested cooperation without revealing anything more. During the drive, they spoke about practical matters, timelines, responsibilities, the kind of conversation that assumes agreement before it is ever confirmed. I listened, occasionally responding when necessary, but mostly allowing them to fill the space with their plans. What they did not realize was that every detail they discussed, every decision they outlined, was building something fragile, something dependent on a version of reality that no longer existed. As we pulled into the parking lot of the attorney's office, I took a slow breath and rested my hands in my lap, steady and still. I was not there to resist them, not yet. I was there to understand exactly how far they were willing to go, how much they believed they already controlled, and how confidently they would step forward without realizing that the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. Because the truth, when it finally arrives, does not need to be forced. It only needs to be seen at the moment when there is no longer any way to ignore it. The attorney's office was exactly as I remembered it, quiet, orderly, designed to make everything feel official and final, as if once something was said within those walls, it could not be taken back. I walked in between Daniel and Sophia, not behind them, not led by them, but simply present, allowing them to believe the arrangement meant something it did not. The receptionist greeted us with a polite smile and directed us toward the conference room where the meeting would take place. Sophia stepped slightly ahead, opening the door as if she belonged there, her movements smooth, confident, almost rehearsed. Daniel followed closely, holding the folder of documents they had been organizing, his grip firm, but his expression uncertain in a way. He did not seem to notice himself. I took my seat across from them, placing my own folder neatly on the table, my hands resting lightly on top of it, steady and still. The attorney entered a moment later, offering condolences again, his tone respectful, measured, but his eyes observant, taking in the room, the dynamic, the unspoken hierarchy that had already begun to form. He began by outlining the standard process, the review of existing assets, the steps required to ensure everything was properly accounted for, the kind of explanation meant to create a sense of order in a time that often feels uncertain. Sophia nodded along, occasionally interjecting with clarifications, referencing documents, guiding the conversation in subtle ways that suggested she had already formed a clear plan. Daniel agreed with her at each point, his voice quiet, supportive, his attention fixed more on her than on the attorney himself. I listened carefully, not just to what was being said, but to what was being assumed. At one point, Sophia leaned forward slightly and mentioned that certain accounts had already been consolidated, that they had taken steps to simplify the financial structure to avoid complications moving forward. She spoke as if this had been a necessary action, something done in the interest of efficiency, something that did not require further discussion. The attorney paused briefly, his pen resting against the paper in front of him, and asked for documentation to support those changes. Daniel quickly slid a set of papers across the table, his movements eager, as if providing proof would solidify their position. I watched the exchange without interruption, noting the small shift in the attorney's expression as he reviewed the documents, the way his focus sharpened, the way his questions became slightly more precise. He asked about timelines, authorization, confirmation of consent, each question simple on its own, but together forming a pattern that required clear answers. Sophia responded smoothly, her tone confident, offering explanations that sounded reasonable, structured, prepared. Daniel added small confirmations where needed, reinforcing her statements without hesitation. I remained silent, my hands still resting on my folder, my gaze steady, allowing the conversation to unfold exactly as they intended. What they did not realize was that every answer they gave, every assumption they reinforced, was building a record, one that did not yet challenge them, but would soon become impossible to ignore. When the attorney finally turned to me, asking if I had any additional information or concerns to share, I met his eyes calmly and shook my head, offering a simple response that there was nothing further at this time. Sophia's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Daniel exhaled slightly, and the meeting continued, moving toward what they believed was a natural conclusion. But as I sat there, listening to the final details being outlined, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed this moment confirmed their control, that everything discussed within this room supported the version of events they had already accepted as truth. And I allowed them to believe it, because the more certain they became, the more complete their understanding would feel, and the less prepared they would be for the moment when that understanding no longer held. Because the truth does not need to interrupt. It only needs to arrive when there is nowhere left for anyone to turn away from it. When the meeting ended, nothing felt different on the surface, and that was exactly what made it so effective. Daniel gathered the documents with a quiet sense of accomplishment, his movements more confident than before, while Sophia thanked the attorney with that same composed tone she had maintained throughout. Her posture relaxed now, as if the most important part of the process had already been secured. I stood at the table for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting the papers in my folder, giving them time to step ahead, to move forward with the certainty they had built for themselves inside that room. As we walked out together, I noticed how easily they fell into conversation about next steps, timelines, responsibilities, speaking in terms that assumed ownership, control, finality. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I simply listened, letting each word settle into place, confirming what I already understood. The drive home was quieter than before, not because there was nothing left to say, but because they no longer felt the need to explain anything to me. Sophia checked something on her phone, occasionally mentioning tasks that needed to be handled in the coming days, while Daniel nodded along, asking small questions that she answered quickly, efficiently. I sat in the back seat, watching the road pass by through the window, the movement steady, predictable, almost calming in its repetition. It reminded me of something my husband used to say, that people reveal the most about themselves when they believe the outcome is already decided. By the time we pulled into the driveway, they had already begun discussing changes to the house, subtle at first, adjustments that sounded practical, reasonable, temporary. Sophia mentioned reorganizing certain rooms, making better use of space, simplifying things for the future. Daniel agreed, adding that it might be easier for me if things were structured differently, if responsibilities were shifted in a way that reduced what I needed to manage. I stepped out of the car slowly, taking in the familiar view of the house, the same one I had seen every day for years, and listened as they continued speaking just behind me, their voices low but clear enough to understand. They were not asking for permission. They were preparing to move forward. Inside, Sophia set her bag down on the kitchen counter as if it belonged there, glancing around with a quiet sense of assessment, while Daniel placed the folders on the table and began sorting through them again, as though the process was already ongoing, already theirs to continue. I moved past them without urgency, setting my own folder down in its usual place, my hands steady, my expression unchanged. What they did not notice was that I was no longer watching them to understand what they were doing. I was watching to see how far they would go without being challenged. That evening, after they left, I walked back into the study and stood in the same spot I had the night before, the room just as still, just as composed, as if nothing had been disturbed. I opened the drawer again, not to search, but to confirm, to remind myself that everything was exactly where it needed to be. The envelope remained untouched, the key hidden in plain sight, the instructions clear, precise, waiting. I closed the drawer gently and rested my hand against the desk, letting the quiet settle around me once more. Because now, it was no longer about discovering the truth or even understanding it. It was about timing. They believed they had already reached the point where everything was decided, where the future had been shaped according to their plans. And that belief was the final piece my husband had been waiting for, the moment when confidence turns into exposure, when certainty becomes the very thing that reveals what has been hidden. I turned off the light and stepped out of the room, leaving everything exactly as it was, because sometimes the strongest move is not to change anything at all, but to let others continue until they reach the point where stopping is no longer possible. The moment came sooner than they expected, but exactly when it needed to. 3 days after the meeting, Daniel called again, his voice carrying a new kind of certainty, the kind that comes when someone believes there is nothing left to question. He said the attorney wanted to finalize a few remaining details, just a brief follow-up to close everything properly. Sophia added in the background that it would be efficient to have all parties present, that it would ensure a smooth transition moving forward. I agreed without hesitation, my tone calm, almost reassuring, giving them no reason to anticipate anything different from what they had already convinced themselves was true. When we arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt familiar, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, more deliberate, like a room waiting for a conversation it already knew would not go as planned. We took our seats at the same table, Daniel and Sophia across from me, their posture composed, their expressions controlled, but there was an ease in them that had not been there before. The attorney entered with a folder. Thicker than the last, his greeting polite, but his eyes sharper, more focused. He began by reviewing the updates they had provided, the adjustments they claimed to have made, the structure they believed was now in place. Sophia nodded along, occasionally reinforcing a point, while Daniel remained steady beside her, his confidence quiet but present. Then the attorney paused, just long enough to shift the rhythm of the room, and turned toward me. He asked, in a tone that sounded simple but carried weight, whether I had anything to add before finalizing the record. For the first time since the funeral, I did not answer immediately. I opened my folder slowly, not searching, but selecting, and placed a single document on the table between us. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The paper spoke for itself, clear, precise, unmistakable. I explained calmly that there was an account not previously discussed, one established separately, with specific conditions attached. Sophia's expression changed first, not drastically, but enough to reveal the moment her certainty began to fracture. Daniel looked at her, then back at the document, his confidence shifting into something less stable, something searching. The attorney reached forward, reviewing the document carefully, his posture straightening as he read. I continued, not raising my voice, not rushing, simply stating the terms as they were written, the safeguards, the clauses, the requirement for full disclosure that had not been met. The room grew quieter with each word, not because I was speaking loudly, but because there was nothing left to fill the space between what they believed and what was now undeniable. Sophia attempted to respond, her tone controlled but sharper now, suggesting there must have been an oversight, a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected quickly. The attorney did not respond to her immediately. Instead, he finished reading, placed the document back on the table, and explained in clear, measured language that the conditions outlined had already been triggered, that certain actions taken without proper authorization required a formal review, and that until that process was complete, all related assets would be temporarily restricted. Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table, his gaze fixed on the document, as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. Sophia remained still, her composure intact on the surface, but the calculation behind her eyes had shifted into something else entirely, something that no longer resembled control. I closed my folder and rested my hands on top of it, the same way I had at the beginning, steady, unchanged. I did not need to say anything more. The structure my husband had built was already doing what it was designed to do. As we stood to leave, no one spoke right away. The silence was different this time, not empty, not uncertain, but complete. Because the moment they had been moving toward with such confidence had arrived, just not in the way they expected. And as we walked out of the office, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had spent all this time believing I was the one who did not understand what was happening. But understanding was never the problem. Timing was. And now, the timing belonged to me.